If you were a billionaire author who was also a very subpar screenplay writer, what would you spend your time doing on your Twitter account followed by millions? Would you respond to fan questions about the films, books you had written? Would you, I don't know, enjoy the admiration of your peers and absolutely millions of fans who are obsessed with your work? Or would you spend all your time launching a crusade against some of the most marginalized people in society, continually double down, spread falsehoods, and also spread far right propaganda and promote far right voices, because that is what JK Rowling has chosen for herself. She essentially does not care about her reputation with a lot of her younger fans, more progressive fans, or even some of the people who starred in the movies based on her work. She just wants to go on this crusade against transgender people under the guise of liberal feminism, because as we all know, Ben Shapiro, Richard Spencer, and Donald Trump Jr. love retweeting liberal feminists. If these are the people who like your work and like your tweets, maybe you're going to have to reassess your politics. Now, JK Rowling is someone I've hated for a long time. She wasn't as visible for the trans stuff back in the day, but she's always been visible as an anti-left liberal who was happy to smear Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite, always been like one of these anti-left Labour people. And liberals in the UK are like a different breed because they don't even pay lip service to progressive causes often. Like, you'll have Joe Biden say trans rights. Liberals in the UK don't even care about that. I think the saying, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleed, applies way more in the UK than it does in the US, because these guys are not even pretending sometimes. If you go on JK Rowling's Twitter account, you will be met by her just retweeting the most unhinged stuff from the most unhinged people. And it's clear who she sides with. And the only silver lining to all this stuff, I think, is people are realizing that JK Rowling is actually a pretty terrible writer. I could have told you that from how bad the Fantastic Beasts movies are. Literally some of the worst movies I've ever seen, and now there's a new one coming out. But she also likes to include her personal politics in her more recent work, including her hatred for Jeremy Corbyn and her animosity towards transgender people. She often pretends she's actually siding with transgender people, but she doesn't want to like minimize liberal feminism. And as you'll see in this video today, you can't really take those statements seriously. So today we're going to discuss her recent controversies, people on the far right who love her. Then I want to talk about how transphobia is at the forefront of this like far right campaign in Western countries like the UK and the US, and essentially is being used like a Trojan horse of these people to make a far right agenda more mainstream. And then we're going to talk about the historic links between fascism and anti-LGBT politics. But before we go any further, if you want to support my channel no matter what happens, this video will be demonetized because of the subject matter, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of that are you get my Nintendo Switch friend code and access to the private patrons Discord server. Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, on Instagram. Also come join the community on my subreddit. Check out my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra. And if you want to support this video, please like the video and potentially leave a comment with your thoughts, because engagement helps this video do well and ultimately helps my channel. So the title of this video will probably allude to some sort of right-wing figures absolutely now loving JK Rowling for her crusade against trans people. So back in December she tweeted this: "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, penis, individual who raped you is a woman," quote tweeting a Times article saying the absurdity of police logging rapists as women. Who retweets this? Ben Shapiro, Donald Trump Jr., Imar's Chongra underneath, based Speak Truth to Power, and Richard Spencer, famous American neo-Nazi, also retweeted this. All these people are famous for being transphobe, that's safe to say. Ben Shapiro, of course, does not even care about being transphobic. He made a whole video about Elliot Page, essentially just dead naming them the whole time and talking about how insane this all is.
So let me read you the headline from CNN, which conveys zero information. Right? We have now been forced as a society to simply say nonsense, to simply just say things that are nonsense, that don't make any sort of logical sense, that don't actually translate from English to reason. Okay, so here is the headline, and you tell me if you know what the hell this means. Okay, ready? Elliot Page, Juno star, shares transgender identity. Do you have any idea what that means? Like, seriously, do you have any idea what that means? When I first saw the headline Elliot Page, I thought, whoa, Ellen has a brother? Because the media have created this bizarre standard whereby if a person declares themselves a member of the opposite gender, the entire world, especially in the media, must immediately flip on a dime, stop calling them by the name everybody knew them as. You end up with complete nonsense. Just complete bleh.
So if people like Ben Shapiro are finding your stances on transgender people worthy of being retweeted, as Richard Spencer did as well, as did Donald Trump Jr., maybe you are not a liberal, maybe you are either sliding into the far right or you are embracing the far right as your new allies against transgender people. So to get into the context of his tweet a bit more, Vice reporting on it when it happened, JK Rowling just won't stop attacking trans people online. JK Rowling is apparently still fixated on portraying transgender women as predators. In a tweet on Sunday, the Harry Potter author attacked, reporting that police in Scotland would record rapes as being committed by a woman if the assailant identifies as female. Then talking about the tweet, the comment is only the latest in a string of efforts by the once beloved author to amplify a narrative that's not only essentially false, but also ignores the devastatingly high level of violence experienced by trans people. In June 2020, Rowling published a 3,700 word essay about what her fears around she called the new trans activism, accusing trans people of pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. That essay quickly sparked accusations JK Rowling was a TERF or a trans-exclusive radical feminist, as Rowling drew on her own experience as a sexual assault survivor to suggest that trans women are a threat to cisgender women. In the years plus since, Rowling has sporadically implied that trans people and those who advocate for their rights are dangerous, but Rowling's narrative that trans people are somehow perpetuating an Orwellian takeover is misleading on multiple fronts. It obscures the fact that it's cis men, not trans women, who regularly commit sexual assault. Only a fraction of a percent of US adults identify as transgender, yet almost 1 in 5 women have experienced completed or attempted rape, according to the Centers for Disease Control. For anyone trying to pin the epidemic of assault on trans people, the numbers just don't add up. People will say from one side of their mouth that trans women are an incredibly small part of the population and that the world shouldn't bend to their desires, but will then say that they are so influential and powerful that they must be stopped, specifically to save women from rape. Trans people are also facing a staggering amount of violence. In a 2015 survey of nearly 28,000 trans adults living in the US, the National Center for Transgender Equality found that 47% of respondents said they had been sexually assaulted in their life. So far in 2021, at least 50 transgender or gender non-conforming people have been violently killed, according to a tally by the Human Rights Campaign. What always fascinates me about liberals or even leftists who are against like trans rights generally is that they essentially just regurgitate homophobia from the 1980s. So it's all focused on bathrooms and rape and things like that. And also the implication for a lot of these things is being transgender or being gay is some sort of sexual perversion, sexual degeneracy. It's all motivated by being a sexual predator. That's why the bathroom things with gay men and transgender people has been such a hysterical topic for decades now, because they believe trans and gay people essentially are just ferociously driven by sex, and that's all they care about and that's all they want to do. There are so many people who repeat this bathroom stuff, and of course it's just like a culture war issue, because like the article said, transgender people are a very small minority. But at the same time, according to these liberals and far-right people, they are controlling the whole media and the whole agenda, and they're destroying Western culture. That's what these people legitimately think. And I actually liked this post by a Republican governor, I believe, who vetoed an anti-trans bill to do with transgender athletes because he said there were only like 4 transgender athletes in his state. And the hatred they are getting is obviously some whipped up culture war. And this is essentially like a non-issue. And of course, things like transgender athletes, bathroom bills, all this type of stuff is used by the far right and right-wing elements to whip people up into a frenzy to get them to vote for them. Take that a step further, you have to be even sicker, because if you're a smart woman like JK Rowling clearly is, who's written successful works and stuff like that, and being insanely wealthy, for you to spend half of your career now just shitting on one of the most vulnerable groups in society is just completely sick. But just like how I mentioned, transphobia and homophobia often go together, JK Rowling seems to be sliding in that direction as well. So this is a recent controversy from the 21st of March. So South Wales police have been doing like a community outreach for the gay community, locally. So Pink News reporting JK Rowling mocks tweet about police's LGBT outrage efforts near the site of a homophobic murder. South Wales Police's LGBT plus network set up an information kiosk complete with rainbow police cards in Cardiff city centre on Friday to showcase their specialist work tackling anti-LGBT plus hate crimes and promoting inclusion and diversity. The community outreach efforts were taking place near Boot Park, where last year bisexual doctor Gary Jenkins was brutally beaten, robbed and killed in a homophobic attack. So they tweeted, "We are in Cardiff City Centre today promoting the work of our network with officers. We were grateful to be able to attend Cardiff City Centre today alongside South Wales Police's SCO, spending time engaging with our LGBTQ plus communities with a focus on recruitment and hate crime." Comments from anti-LGBT plus trolls soon began to roll in, with Twitter users accusing South Wales Police of virtue signalling and wasting cars that should be on patrol. This is when the police force responded, "Supporting our communities is not virtual signalling, and we make no apologies for doing so." The simple typo included even more ridicule, including from JK Rowling, apparently mocking South Wales Police's outreach as insincere. On Monday, she tweeted, "Virtual signalling like virtue signalling, but for people who can't be asked." Many were quick to condemn Rowling's tweet, suggesting that mocking a police force carrying out vital LGBT plus outreach near the site of a homophobic murder was inappropriate. David Paisley tweeting, "The virtue signalling JK Rowling is laughing about is South Wales Police's LGBT plus network doing community outreach work 10 minutes walk from where Dr. Gary Jenkins was murdered." Benjamin Butterworth, "Repulsive, ignorant comment. Does the safety of LGBT people not matter to you at all?" India Willoughby tweeting, "Even by JK Rowling standards, this is ghastly." Jesse Gender tweeting, "Just this week, JK Rowling has vilified Wales Police LGBTQ network doing community outreach after a man was killed in a hate crime as virtue signalling. Also spread misinformation from a now deleted Twitter account about transgender detransition." I'll talk about this a bit later. "This is what trans people talk about when we discuss the harm Rowling continually platform supporters. She may do charity work for kids, cool, but she also is an active force for hate." Someone mentioned that she was promoting misinformation, so here is what they were talking about. Someone tweeted JK Rowling saying, "At 16, I was prescribed testosterone after 2 therapy visits. They didn't ask about my BPD or past trauma. I now have PCOS, am awaiting testing to determine if I need a hysterectomy, have cancer, and I will never be able to afford breast reconstruction. My consent was not informed." JK Rowling tweets, "This breaks my heart. I've now spoken to many young women who tell similar stories. I'm appalled that you were let down in this way by people who had a duty of care towards you. Hoping to God the tests give good news and sending you much love." Someone retweeting this, "The account retweeted by JK Rowling claims to have had tea after 2 appointments at age 16. But also claims to be 27 years old. So this happened in 2011. Do you believe that?" So True tweeting, "This didn't happen. It's a story made up specifically to inflame resentment against the trans community. I know it didn't happen because that is not how the system works. Context is important. If you put the 1% of trans people that detransition front and center, the implication is that 100% of trans people go on to regret it. When 99% of trans people don't, it's a very disingenuous narrative and it's very deliberate." So JK Rowling just out here retweeting anyone who seems to confirm her narrative without doing much research into how these procedures even operate is pretty on brand and just shows you what her campaign is all about. Now, like I said, her anti-transgender politics don't just kind of stop with her Twitter. She actually includes them in her book. Now, she goes by the pen name of Robert Galbraith for these like adult books. Now, people have been pointing out recently there was another person called Robert Galbraith Heath, who is someone who pioneered gay conversion therapy. Now, she says this is inspired by someone she liked who was called Galbraith and Robert F. Kennedy. But let me just go into this quickly, a Newsweek article, because it's been coming up lately. Fans and detractors on Twitter have called out author JK Rowling for her pseudonym, Robert Galbraith. They allege the name was inspired by Robert Galbraith Heath, a psychologist known for his work on gay conversion therapy. Heath was a psychologist who lived from 1915 until 1999. In 1970, according to the Journal of Neurosurgery, he used a method called deep brain stimulation to try and perform conversion therapy on subjects. After the experiment, Heath called it a success, saying that the patient was now straight, although the GNS states that this has been disputed, and it has been reported that patients B19 still engage in gay sexual activities after therapy. So like I said, JK Rowling heavily disputes that is what she based her name on. And she said it's like RFK, and there's someone called Emma Galbraith that she mixed the names together to come to this. Obviously, no one knows how she came to this name. I'm not going to say she 100% picked a guy doing gay conversion therapy. But I must say, even people connecting those two things together shows you how far JK Rowling's public perception has shifted to the right and how much she has embraced right-wing reactionary politics if people think she, as a so-called liberal feminist, supposedly based her pen name on a guy who pioneered essentially torture of gay people. I do want to talk about her books recently. So an article by Emily Kirkpatrick, JK Rowling proves her commitment to transphobia in her new novel. No longer satisfied with simply repeatedly expressing her transphobic opinions on Twitter and in 3,700 word screeds on her personal website, JK Rowling now appears to be bringing her turf logic to bookshelves near you in her new novel, Troubled Blood. According to an early review in The Telegraph, Troubled Blood, the fifth installment in Rowling's Cormoran Strike series, written under the pen name Robert Galbraith, deals with the cold case of a woman who disappeared in 1974 and is believed to be the victim of Dennis Creed, quotes, a transvestite serial killer. And obviously, if you guys grew up the same age as me, you've heard this word before, but it's an outdated and derogatory term for cross-dressing, which is not the same as being transgender. The review goes on to say, one wonders what critics of Rowling's stance on trans issues will make of a book whose moral seems to be never trust the man in a dress. This isn't the first time Rowling's anti-trans opinions have found their way onto the pages of this particular series. In the second Cormoran Strike book, The Silkworm, a woman named Pippa stalks Detective Strike before attempting to stab him. Strike traps her in his office, revealing her identity as a trans woman, with Rowling adding in a description of her Adam's apple and hands. The detective then tells Pippa that prison won't be fun for you, not pre-op. Rowling's representatives did not immediately respond to a request for comment. So obviously that's like completely gross, but also this is nothing new. So in JK Rowling's new novel, a villain is an Israel-hating anti-Semite. For months, author JK Rowling has been warning about the dangers of anti-Semitism in England, sparring on Twitter with critics who either downplay the phenomenon or say its proponents are confusing criticism of Israel with Jew hatred. Now in her newest book, she includes a character whose obsessive anti-Zionism morphs into anti-Semitism, and this was a clear reference to Jeremy Corbyn, who she absolutely hates, and constantly inferred he was anti-Semitic. This is probably for another video, but Rowling's writing is just absolutely terrible anyway, and the thematic elements of it often do not make sense and just put her weird politics at the center of it. Remember the second Fantastic Beasts movies, where the wizards trying to stop humans from doing the Holocaust were like bad, kind of? Like, that was the most bizarre plotline. Here you have a character, Grindelwald, who's meant to be like inspired in a way by like Hitler's race purity, but at the same time, it's also a guy who's trying to stop humans from doing World War II and the Holocaust. Like, completely bizarre. I've read so many good articles criticizing this narrative, but that is probably for another video, as is the new recent stuff of the Harry Potter game and the Goblin Uprising, and the really problematic depictions of goblins and race in Harry Potter. I've made a couple videos talking about this. So JK Rowling obviously is embracing these far-right people, is embracing more right-wing reactionary politics, is perfectly happy to include bigoted stuff in her novels, as well as just tweet ridiculous stuff on Twitter constantly to her new right-wing fans. Kind of reminds me of Russell Brand in a way. Now, something people constantly ask is like, why is Britain so transphobic? And there was a poll recently that like Britain was far less transphobic than the stereotype really makes it seem. But the problem is the media class and politicians are very transphobic. And there's a really good article by Eddie Miller from 2018 saying, why is the British media so transphobic? And I think this is interesting and getting into why Britain specifically has this problem with so-called liberals. Like, you're not going to get JK Rowling tweeting trans rights the same way Joe Biden said trans rights. Not that I'm saying Joe Biden is a massive campaigner for trans rights, but you get my point that they won't even say this stuff. So the article says, it's worth asking how transphobic narratives focused on depicting trans women in particular as a threat have gained disproportionate traction in the UK establishment media in the last decade, especially among women who should be allies. The answer lies in part to the coalescence of a certain set of ideas in a very specific circle of voices that later went on to hold high-profile positions in much of the UK's print and broadcast media. I'm referring to the UK skeptics movement of the early 2000s, despite the fact that it was basically a loose network of people who were far too impressed with themselves and not believing in astrology, they had an outsized legacy. The movement consisted largely of groups meeting in pubs and organising talks promoting a specific brand of scientific skepticism concerned primarily with the debunking of alternative medicine and pseudoscience. So far, so niche, but there is compelling evidence that suggests that both the ideological basis and some of the specific proponents of UK skepticism in the noughties are implicated in the spread of transphobic thinking into the mainstream media. While claiming to be the country's foremost critical thinkers, the group was riddled with anti-humanities bias and a fetish for certain kind of science that it held to reveal a set of immutable principles based on which the world was built, with almost no regard whatsoever for interpretive analysis based on social or historical factors. Part of this mode of thinking was an especially reductive biologism, the idea that there are mutable realities to be found in our DNA, and if we just paid enough attention to science and stopped trying to split hairs and discover meaning over in the superfluous disciplines of humanities, and everything would be much simpler. It's precisely this kind of biological essentialism which skirts dangerously close to eugenics that leads people to think they can debunk a person's claim to their gender identity, or that it should be subjected to rigorous testing by someone in a lab coat before we can believe the subject is who they say they are. That is actually really, really interesting for me as someone who's made videos about why the skeptic movement online jumped from anti-religion and atheism to anti-feminism. This is very interesting to me in that they think many things cannot be proved unless you have like loads of scientific data, like very, very overwhelmingly conclusive. And this is why they often reject things like systemic racism or police brutality, often being motivated by this racism. And of course, a lot of them are also big into eugenics. Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins have both expressed like interest in eugenics. Sam Harris has platformed Charles Murray. Dawkins has his own things talking about that. And I think this makes a really good point in how this type of thinking leads to this. But these voices did not go away. Many of the figures who made up the movement are now prominent voices at one level or another. Helen Lewis, for example, is the deputy editor of the centre-left political magazine The New Statesman and has promoted a barrage of anti-trans articles. Julie Bindel at The Guardian and elsewhere has a well-documented history of transphobia. 2 people retweeted by JK Rowling. Helen Lewis is funny because she was actually booted from Watchdogs Legion's radio after the fact for her transphobia. The other path through which many British women have taken up the particularly transphobic ideology is somewhat incongruently the parenting website Mumsnet. You guys might have heard of this if you're from the UK. The idea that a forum in which women talk about diaper rash would produce a wave of turf sounds a bit off, but in the UK this has reached the status of conventional wisdom. For long though, certain members of the platform developed an obsession that trans women aren't actually women, and instead violent men intent on gaining access to women's bathrooms, prison and domestic violence shelters to harm them, and the idea that gender self-identification is ripe for abuse by cis men who claim to be trans. And that is something that is at the heart of the anti-trans movement, something I referenced earlier. Essentially, a lot of these things are like homophobia from the 80s and 90s repackaged, target trans people with a new spin. As you might imagine, the whole conversation takes on the Helen Lovejoy style think of the children tenor, which is very effective for radicalization since it stokes one's own fears and helps to spread feelings of panic. There is also the sad fact that on any platform where groups of women convene to discuss their lives and experiences, they will have stories of sexual violence in common, so it's particularly odious to see transphobes prey upon those experiences of sexual violence to stoke hatred towards trans women, who are themselves disproportionately vulnerable to violence. Mumsnet is to British transphobia more like what 4chan is to American fascism. The tendencies were already there, but a message board to amplify them and recruit people to their cause never hurts. So if you're online, the skeptic community in your mind primarily refers to, I guess, more like American-centric thinkers. But of course you had people like Dawkins and New Atheists who are considered skeptics. But I guess for like YouTube skeptics, although you have like one of the most prominent being a British guy, Sargon of Akkad, a lot of them are like from the Western world. But that is very interesting, and it's something I've been saying about the skeptic community and its offshoots, the anti-SJW community, which I do believe is an offshoot of the skeptic community of like the mid-2010s, is that this like rational thinking where they only think with like tangible evidence and reject like anecdotal experience, lived in experience, or even sometimes like historical data about these things, basically in favor of like shitting on anyone who's left wing. So like I said, people like Armored Skeptic, Sargon of Akkad, Sam Harris, these people essentially deny that systemic racism is either a thing, some of them, or it's not much of a problem, it's just like massively exaggerated. So is systemic sexism. So it's probably not surprising that these people reject a lot of the science about transgender people, and it's ironic that a lot of these movements started as a response to the Christian right and the anti-science agenda, and they've come full circle where they are rejecting science in favor of their own bigotry. Now, something I learned about, I think it was last year, is about the Weimar Republic and the LGBT community and academic work done on the LGBT community that was of course burnt by the Nazis. Now, of course, it's probably not surprising to anyone that Nazis and fascists do not like transgender people. They are sexist, and they, of course, are homophobic, because in the fascist view, you are being more like traditionalist. So it's about like a man and a woman, a family. In Nazi Germany, of course, women did not have equal rights. They were expected to stay at home, be the head of the family, and the man had like the role of the provider or the role of like the soldier and everything like that. It's pretty similar to a lot of Western things, but taken more to an extreme in that they just did not accept women having any other role. So it's not surprising they absolutely hated the LGBT community, although it is funny that Ernst Röhm, who was the leader of the brown shirts and obviously like a personal close ally of Hitler, was in fact gay and tried to reconcile him being gay by saying there could be like this gay vanguard of fascism, like the Spartans or the Thebians in ancient Greece or something like that. But at the end of the day, fascists and the right wing will never accept people who do not fit into their very, very narrow view of the world and humanity. I just want to get into how transphobia has always been at the heart of fascism and is still at the heart of fascism, and how JK Rowling and people like her, even if they aren't specifically fascists themselves, promoting this agenda is ultimately helping fascism. So Talia Levin, why transphobia is at the heart of the white power movement. A significant number of the books that were burned had made up the library of the Jewish sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, whose Institute of Sexual Studies was the first clinic in the world to provide surgical interventions allowing trans individuals to live in the bodies they sought. The Institute, which opened in 1919, provided care that sought to dispel the shame that surrounded same-sex love and gender nonconformity, published path-breaking research into trans-affirming care, and gave office space to feminist activists. Love, Hirschfeld wrote in 1912, the natural laws of love is as varied as people are. This notion was intolerable to the Nazi state, and all 10,000 of the volumes in the Institute's library, priceless and rare material, German and foreign, much of it addressing same-sex eroticism and gender nonconformity, were collected and were consigned to the flames. It is only now, nearly a century later, that the void left by the destruction of this pioneering work has begun to be filled. Far-right vanguard of this expression in groups like Patriot Front, the Proud Boys, and other loose fraternities of convenience expresses its anger towards gender nonconformity with violence. In early July, an anonymous user uploaded a video to Instagram showing her berating the staff of an LA queer-friendly spa, denouncing the supposed presence of a trans woman in the locker room besides kids. Within a few days, protesters, including the Proud Boys, assembled outside the spa. Far-right extremists stabbed 2 people in the melee, with trans rights counter-protesters. Slate journalist Evan Urquhart noted that was likely no trans woman there to begin with, only underscores how thin a pretext is needed to prompt these sorts of outbursts from the far right. I don't know if JK Rowling tweeted anything about that spa thing, but does that seem like something you wouldn't see on her Twitter feed? Would she not feed into this absolute hysteria about a supposed trans person going around a kid's changing room? Again, it's all focused on trans people, gay people, the LGBT community being insane sexual degenerates who cannot help their sexual lust. They will become transgender just to fulfill some sort of kink. That is what these people think of transgender people. So JK Rowling, whether she knows it or not, is promoting a far-right campaign of transphobia, which often is a Trojan horse because they frame it in ways of like protecting children, protecting women's sports, protecting feminism, protecting women's spaces, all this total garbage. But when you have Ben Shapiro and Richard Spencer, a neo-Nazi, retweeting your transphobia, you know what this campaign is leading to. You are radicalizing people into an ideology that is far right, and that is what you're doing with your massive influence and billions of pounds. Is you're choosing to be a force for hate in this world. You're choosing to punch down on one of the most marginalized, vulnerable groups in society, and you're doing it under the guise of trying to protect feminism, women, and liberalism, when you are essentially just promoting far-right ideologies that will only embolden the far right. We've seen this massive war on trans people in the UK, especially in the US. They hate trans people. They don't want trans people to exist. And JK Rowling is either being a useful idiot for these people by thinking she's defending feminism, or she's starting to agree with more right-wing reactionary arguments against transgender people. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the video. You guys will not have noticed this, but I actually stopped recording this video about 4 times because a plumber was coming in our apartment at about 8:30 at night. Very, very frustrating. Thankfully, I got through this all, and I hope the video quality does not suffer. Anyway, if you made it this far, consider subscribing, like the video, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle, Twitter and Instagram, consider becoming a patron, and subscribe to my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra. I'm glad I got all that in before there's another knock on the door for the plumber coming back. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.